Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah here. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and Mirz Hashem today we will be completing Daf Samach Beis Amud Aleph, as well as doing, I hope, most of Samach Beis Amud Beis. So we are continuing to learn Hilchas B'tzias HaPas. Today we really get into B'tzias HaPas. Now the words B'tzias HaPas means breaking the bread. So we washed on the Netilas Yadayim, right? We just spent quite a bit of time learning Hilchas Netilas Yadayim, and now it's time to make the hamotzie and literally break the bread. You're going to cut the bread and you're going to start eating. So here on Samach Beis Amud Aleph, near the bottom, we begin in Siman Kuf Samach Zayin, Mekayim U'Ziman HaBetzia, the proper place and the time for the betzia, for the breaking or cutting of the bread. Umihu habaytzea, and who is the one that should actually cut the bread after making the hamotzie? Ubaychav seifim, and here we have 20 seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Baitzea bapas, when we break the bread, so we're going to make a hamotzie, and we're going to cut a piece of bread in order to eat it. So Baitzea bapas, we cut the bread to cut off a piece and eat it. We cut from a part of the bread that is well baked. And says the Ramah, ubepastidon, when it comes to our bread, and the Mishnah Berurah is going to mention a Bir Hagra that takes issue with the words bepastidon, our bread. It sounds like our bread is different than bread in previous days. The Bir Hagra says, I don't know what the Ramah means, that there's no difference between our bread and their bread, but the Ramah says here, ubepastidon, when it comes to our bread, yesh livtzaya b'tzad hapas, we should cut a piece off the side of the loaf, v'yachtoich ma'at mitzado elyon v'hatachtoin. When the Ramah says that we should cut from the side of the loaf, what he means is we want to take a cross section. We want to slice from the top down through the bottom, so that when we cut a slice to eat after making the hamotzie, that piece should have some of the top crust and some of the bottom crust. Okay. Let's pause here for a moment and let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. So let's see Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Aleph. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Baitzea bepas b'makayim, we should go ahead and cut the bread, and the words of the Mechaber were b'makayim shene'afa heitev, in a part of the loaf where it is well baked. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hainu la'achar shenata yadav la'achila, after you washed Netilas Yadayim for the Suda, and now you want to make a hamotzie and you want to eat. You're now going to be cutting off a piece of lechem, a piece of bread, to eat it. Now, this piece of bread that you're going to eat is very, very chashuv. You know why it's chashuv? Because it's the piece that you just made the bracha on. Now, of course, all the bread that you're going to eat during the Suda, and the truth is, if you're being kaveh Suda al pas, all the food that you eat during the Suda, you're pottering with this bracha of hamotzie lechem and aretz. But that first piece that you cut and you eat right after making the bracha, that is the piece for the bracha. So when you make a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzie lechem and aretz, and now you cut a piece and you eat it, that is the b'tzias hapas, that's the piece of bread that's l'chvoid the bracha. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, who b'tzeya l'chvoid habracha, you're cutting off a piece l'chvoid the bracha, and that should be b'makom shene'afa heitev. It should be a part of the loaf that's well baked. Dahainu b'makom hakosher, that means it's the crust, it's the part that's crusty. V'loi b'makom harach be'emtzi isoi, not the soft part of the middle of the bread. Ice cut base, and I'll discuss that a little bit greater detail soon. Ice cotton base, ubepasti done. When it comes to our bread, ayin b'bir agra, like I told you, the Mishnah Berurah says, take a look at the bir agra, shemefakvek aloshoin didon, who takes issue with this word pasti done, our bread. To hu hadin b'tanurim shalohen. The same halacha would apply to the ovens back in the day of Chazal, shemedapkin a pas b'tzidei atanur, when they used to make bread by taking a dough and sticking it onto the side wall of the oven. The same halacha would apply that the piece that you cut off of B'tzias HaPas is supposed to be a crusty piece. You should cut from the side and get the top and the bottom. V'ayin b'bir halacha, he says if you want to see a greater detailed discussion of this, take a look at the bir halacha dibra maskalu b'pas didan. Before I explain this any further, let's see Mishnah Berurah's cut and gimel. So the Ramah said, how are you mekayim what the Mechaber said? The Mechaber said that the piece of lechem from the B'tzias HaPas should be from the makom that's ne'efa hetev. It should be part that's baked well. And came along the Ramah, and the Ramah said in order to do that, what you should do is you should cut off a piece from the side of the loaf so that you cut straight through from the top to the bottom, and you get from the top of the bread, you get some of the crust from the top and some of the crust from the bottom. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut gimel. What's the rationale for this? Why do I need to get from the top and the bottom? So the Mishnah Berurah says this is rooted in a Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara Isa, because we have in the Gemara in Sanhedrin Kuf Beis and Beis Lechad Girsa, according to one Girsa in Rashi. We have a Gemara that says Shaboitzea mimakom shemaskala pas likraim ulehispashel, that we're supposed to take for the piece of the bracha, we're supposed to take from the part of the bread that bakes and crusts over first. Now, this Gemara, it happens to be, is a very, very fascinating Gemara. It'll be quicker if I bring it up over here. The very, very fascinating Gemara it happens to be. So let me bring it up. Okay. Bear with me for 1 second. It's Sanhedrin. It's Kuf Bey. Oops. Sanhedrin. And it is on Kuf Bey's Amud Beis. Kuf Bey's Amud Beis. Very, very fascinating Gemara. The Gemara over here in Sanhedrin, in Perak Chelik, we know that there's a lot of fascinating Agadita Gemaras in Chelik. The Gemara over here is discussing several Malchei Yisrael. One of the Malchei Yisrael that the Gemara is talking about is Menashe. Now, when we think of Menashe, we think of Menashe as being one of the Malchei Yisrael, unfortunately, that were tremendous Rishonim. When we think of Menashe, we think right away of Avodah Zarah, and Menashe being a Rasha. So the Gemara says over here, Rav Ashi Uki Ashloisha Melachim. Rav Ashi was discussing three of the Melachim, three of the kings. Amar, he said, L'machar niftach bechavrin. Tomorrow we'll start discussing the our friends, the three kings. Now, what did Rav Ashi mean when he referred to these three kings amongst them, Menashe, as chavrin, as friends? So apparently what he meant was that they were comparable to us in limud HaTorah. So even though we're talking about people over here that have, unfortunately, no chelik in Olam Haba, like Rashi says, L'machar niftach b'chavrin, nidrosh b'chaverenu, we'll give a drasha, we'll speak about our colleagues, our friends, shahayu talmidei chachamim k'maisenu, they were great talmidei chachamim the way we are, ve'ein lahem chelik la'asid, but unfortunately they have no chelik l'Olam Haba. That's what Rav Ashi said. Ooh, also Menashe. Menashe came along, Menashe, the Melech, came, Ischazile Bechelme, and he appeared to Rav Ashi in a dream. Rav Ashi was discussing Menashe. He said he's a Talmid Chacham like us, but he has no chelik l'Olam Haba. came along Menashe, and Menashe said to Rav Ashi, Chavrach v'chaveri da'avach karisalon? You are calling us, and me amongst them, Menashe, you're calling us your friends, your colleagues, and the friends of your fathers? Let me ask you something. Since you're saying that you, Rav Ashi, are comparable to us when it comes to limud HaTorah, let me ask you a shayla. Meheicha bas lemishra hamotzi. When you make hamotzi, where are you supposed to break off the bread from? You make hamotzi on a loaf. You're supposed to make the brach on a shalem, if you can. So you're going to make the brach on a shalem, and now you're going to want to cut off a piece. So Menashe asked Rav Ashi, this is ma'aseh b'chol yom. You eat sudas all the time. You make a brach on a shalem. Tell me, Rav Ashi, where do you break off the piece for hamotzi? Amalei, Rav Ashi said to Menashe, Lo yadana. I don't know. He told him, I don't know. Okay. Amalei, Menashe said to Rav Ashi, Meihecha diba'is lemishra hamotzi loy gemiras. You didn't learn the halacha of where you're supposed to cut off the bread when you make hamotzi, which l'chara sounds like a very pashut halacha that everybody should know. V'chavrach karisalon, and yet you go ahead and you refer to us as being your chaverim, a pashut halacha you don't know. Okay, Amalei, Rav Ashi said back to Menashe, no, agmareli, so teach it to me. You caught me. Does halacha I don't know. You caught me. Teach me the halacha. Ulamachar derishta le bishmach beperka. And tomorrow, when I give shir, I'll quote you. Tomorrow I'll give shir. And I'll say, Rabbi say, Menashe came to me last night in a dream, and he taught me a halacha that I didn't know. Where are you supposed to cut the lechem for hamotzi? Amalei. So Menashe told Rav Ashi, and here's where we get to the shaila of a girsa. Menashe said to Rav Ashi, Meihecha dikarim bishula. You're supposed to break off the bread from the part that got baked into a crust. Dikarim, the word dikarim means it crusted over. So Meihecha dikarim bishula. You're supposed to break off for the hamotzi from the part that got crusted over. Now Rashi says over here in Sanhedrin, what does that mean? He says you're supposed to take from the part that's the crust. Dahainu, says Rashi, either milamala, either from the top of the loaf, oy misvivos hapas, or from the sides of the loaf, oy mishulav, or from the bottom of the loaf, aval be'emtza loy. But what you should not do is take out from the nice soft inside of the bread. That you shouldn't do. Shemeviu lefan of prusa shalechem. He says this is most negeya if you're not making the bracha on a whole loaf. Imeviu lefan of prusa shalechem. If you're making the bracha on a slice of rye bread, so it's not a whole loaf of rye bread, let's say, it's a slice. So now you've got the outside is the crust, and the middle is the nice soft part of the bread. Says Rashi, if they bring you a slice of bread, you should not break and make the bracha. You should take either from the bottom or from the sides or from the top, from the crust, but not from the middle. Now that's if the girsa that you have in the Gemara is Meihecha dikarim bishula. Now the word dikarim is Dalit Kuf Reish Yud Mem. Dikarim, where it's skinned over, where it crusted over. But Rashi says, Lishna Achrina, there's another girsa, there's another lashon in the Gemara that takes out the Reish of dikarim and changes it to a Dalit. And they read the Gemara, Meihecha dikadim bishula, which means where it gets baked first. Keloimar, Meihecha shemaktim la'afos. You take from the loaf where it begins to bake. And says Rashi, v'hainu hach. Now, that's really one and the same. Because where does the loaf start to bake? Obviously, the part of the loaf that bakes first is the outside of the loaf. So either way that you learn the Gemara, whether according to the first girsa that Rashi brings down, or the second girsa, really the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Menashe is telling Rav Ashi the same thing. Menashe is telling Rav Ashi, when you make the bracha on the pas, where should you take from? You should take from a crusty part of the bread, not from the inside soft of the bread. Now let's go back here into the Mishnah Berurah. It's cut and gimel. The Mishnah Berurah says, the Gemara Sanhedrin Kuf Beis Amud Beis is alachad girsa. We have, according to one girsa in the Gemara, which is the Lishta Achrina of Rashi, shebaytzea mimokim shemaschal pas likroi mula hispashel, that you're supposed to take after the bracha from the part of the loaf that crusts over and bakes first. V'yesh mi paiskim shesvir lehu. There are those paiskim that hold tehu tzad elyon me'apas, that which part of the pas bakes first? The top of the loaf. Now, imagine a loaf of rye bread in one of our ovens, in a typical oven. How do you put the loaf of bread in the oven? The dough is on a grate, and you put it in the oven, right? Which part of the loaf is most exposed to the heat? It's the top. The bottom of the loaf is either on the grate or on the floor of the oven. So it's not exposed, the surface is not exposed to the hot air of the oven. But the top of the loaf, and really the sides of the loaf, that's exposed to the fire. It's exposed to the hot air of the oven. So therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, V'yesh bi paiskim shesvir lehu. There are paiskim that hold that what's the part that bakes first? Hu tzado elyon me'apas. That's the upper surface of the bread, shehu neged avir hatanor, which is exposed to the hot air of the oven. But on the other hand, but there are those paiskim that say shetzad hatachton mispashel tchila, that it's actually the bottom of the loaf that bakes first, shemunach al karkes hatanor, because it is in contact with the hot surface of the floor of the oven. Lachein, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, in order to be mekayim both sets of paiskim, tzarich lachtoich min hatzad, what you do is you cut off a slice from the side of the loaf, mei ha'elyon ve'hatachtoin, and you cut a cross piece that gives you the crust of the top and the crust of the bottom, v'yetze yedei shneim, and now you're mekayim the requirements of both sets of paiskim. You're getting the crust from the top and the crust from the bottom. What you see from here is everybody agrees that when you make the bracha, you're supposed to take a crusty part of the loaf. The question is, which crusty part? We have a girsa in the Gemara that says that you're supposed to take for the part that crusts over first. Here we have a question. What crusts over first? Is it the part that's exposed to the hot air of the oven, or is it the part that comes into contact with the hot surface of the oven? So is it the top or is it the bottom? We want to be mekayim both. Take a cross piece, eat from the crust of the top and the crust of the bottom. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. Yeshayim, there are those that say, Shetoiv sheyachtoich b'tzad, shu keneged tzad hamispakeya. Oh, okay, I forgot what this means for a moment. Says the Chavetz Chaim that there are those paiskim that say, Shetoiv sheyachtoich, that it would be proper to cut the piece of bread that you make the hamotzi on, bitzad, from the side of the loaf, shehu kineged, that is opposite, tzad hamispakeya, the side of the loaf that cracks. What does that mean? Well, nowadays, everybody's very into sourdough. Now, if you look at a sourdough loaf, you'll see that the top surface of the sourdough loaf usually cracks and splits open. So the side opposite the cracked side would be the bottom in these sourdough loaves. The top cracks open. There are those paiskim that say that you should take the hamotzi piece from the side that's opposite the side that cracks open. What's the rationale for that? The Chavetz Chaim explains. Ki bezat tzad hiskel le'efos, because the Chavetz Chaim says that the physics of the loaf is as follows. The loaf started to bake from the bottom, and the heat went from the bottom up, v'nidcha kaha'isa, and the dough rose and put pressure on the top, until the top split open. So what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, there are those paiskim that say, if you want to know which part of the loaf baked first, we're telling you that you should take the crusty part that baked first. I'll tell you how you know. The way you know is look at which side of the loaf split open. Whichever side of the loaf split open, the side opposite that is the side that baked first. Why? Because that side baked first, and then the heat went up, put pressure on the top surface of the loaf, and the top surface of the loaf split open. Baprusa, when it comes to the piece that you're cutting off for the hamotzi, yochel livtzaya b'makom shenifras, ve'ein tzarich livtzaya b'makom hashalim. What he's saying is like this. Let's say you have a loaf that was already cut into. So it's not a whole loaf. It's a loaf that already had a piece cut off. We're not talking, let's say, about Shabbos where you need a shalim, you need lechem mishnah, you need two shleimim. No, we're talking about it's a Monday afternoon, and you're making a bracha, and you have a loaf of rye bread. It's not sliced, it's a loaf, but a couple of slices were already taken off the end. So now, do you have to go ahead and take the piece for the betzias apas? Do you have to take it from the, so to speak, whole side of the loaf? Or could you slice yourself a slice off of the open side of the loaf? Says the Mishnah Berurah, you can take from the open side of the loaf. Ain't tzarich litzayah b'makom hashalim. You don't pedafka have to slice off a piece from the closed side of the loaf. You could cut your piece off the open side of the loaf. As long as you do what the Mishnah Berurah has been saying over here, and that is you take a cross cut so that you get the crust from the top and the bottom. And he brings this down from the Pri Megadim. If you have a loaf that got burnt on one end or one part of the loaf, or maybe it was in the oven and it got too close to the charcoal and it got charcoal stuck to it, you should not take the prusas habracha. You shouldn't take the piece that you're making the bracha on from there, liberkas hamotzi, for the bracha of hamotzi, because that's not bakavedik. Okay, so what did we see so far over here in the Mechaber? What we saw is, person washed, he made on l'tilas yadayim, now he's sitting down, he wants to make hamotzi, he wants to start eating. There's a special chashivus to the first piece that you're going to cut off and eat after making the bracha. That is, so to speak, the piece that you're making the bracha on. Therefore, lichvoid the bracha, it has to be a chashav a piece. What have we identified as a chashav a piece? So we have a Gemara in Sanhedrin, no matter which gersa you use, we have a Gemara in Sanhedrin where Menashe told Rav Ashi. It's fascinating that we're using Menashe over here. But Menashe told Rav Ashi that when you make the bracha of hamotzi, you want to take a piece that is crusty. You don't want to take a soft piece, even if that happens to be what you like better. You don't take a nice soft piece from the middle. No, you're supposed to take a crusty piece. Now, according to one girsa in the Gemara, which is brought down as the Lishtach Rina in Rashi, not only are you supposed to take a crusty piece, but you're supposed to take the part that crusts over first. Then we have a question in the Paiskim. Some Paiskim say that's the part of the loaf, the top or the sides, that are exposed to the heat of the oven. That's what crusts over first. So that's what you want to take for the Berchas HaMotzi. Other Paiskim say, no, it's the bottom of the loaf, the part that comes into contact with the hot surface of the oven. That's what crusts over first. How we Mekayim Boshitas? By taking a cross piece of the loaf and making sure that we get crust from the bottom and the top. And again, the whole purpose of this is kavod habracha. Now let's continue in the Mechaber. Bottom line here, Samach Beis Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber. V'yachtoich prusas habetzia. Now you are going to cut off the piece, the prusas habetzia. You're going to cut off the piece that you are breaking the bread with. In other words, your very complicated way of saying, now you're ready to cut off that piece that you're going to eat right after making the bracha. Explains the Mechaber what's the proper way to do this. V'tzarech lachtoich ma'at. The first thing that you do, even before you make the bracha, is you take the knife and you cut into the loaf a little bit where you are going to make that cut. So we've identified already which piece of the loaf you're supposed to cut off. You're supposed to go to the side of the loaf and cut a cross piece to get crust from the top to the bottom. So now explains the Mechaber, what's the proper way to do this? First, before you even make the bracha, take the knife and cut into the loaf a little bit where you're going to slice off the piece that you're going to eat after the bracha. And he says, Yachtoich ma'at, right? V'tzarich lachtoich ma'at. You have to cut into the loaf a little bit. Why a little bit? And it has to be, explains the Mechaber, how much? How much should you cut into the loaf? She'im yerchais baprusa, you have to cut into it until the extent that if you would pick up the loaf by the piece that you're cutting off, if you would pick it up by holding that piece, yalashar kikar imoy, it would pick up the rest of the loaf together with it, and it wouldn't break off. I don't have a loaf of bread here with me. I should have brought one. But okay, let's imagine this is the loaf of bread. So you're going to cut a piece over here. You're going to take a knife. You're going to take a knife, and you're going to cut off this piece over here, this end piece. So says the Mechaber, first, take the knife, cut into the loaf a little bit. Now he said only a little bit. How much? Says the Mechaber, I'll tell you how much. Cut into it to the extent that if you would try to pick up the loaf by the end piece, you would pick it up and it would take the whole loaf with it, not that this piece that you just demarcated with your cut would rip off. That's how much you could cut in. Why? Explains the Mechaber, she'im loikein, because if you cut in more than that, if you make a deep cut over here, and you cut it to the extent that if you try to pick up the loaf by the end, it will break off, she'im loikein chashiv kiprusa, then it's already considered cut off. If the piece that you're cutting off cannot support the rest of the loaf, then we consider it as if it's already separated from the loaf. And then you're making a bracha on a prusa. We don't want you to make a bracha on a prusa, on a piece, lechatchila. The chashivas of the bracha demands that if possible, you should be making a bracha on a shalem. And so if you're going to cut in to the degree that should you try to pick up the loaf by the end piece, the rest of the loaf would fall off, then it's already as if it's separated. And then you're making a bracha essentially on a prusa, which is not covered for the bracha. So that's what the Mechaber says here. Because if you cut more than that, kashav kiprusa. Now it's already like you're making a bracha on a prusa, not on a shalim. V'yanichena mechuberes, continues the Mechaber, you should leave it attached. V'yanichena mechuberes lapas, leave it attached to the rest of the loaf. V'yaschil avarech, and now start making your bracha. V'acher sheyisayim habracha, and after you finish the brachas hamotzie, yafridena, then finish cutting it off and separate it from the loaf, kidei shetichla habracha ba'oitcha pas shalim, so that you should finish the bracha while the loaf is still a shalim. So this all sounded very, very complicated. But in essence, to make it simple, what's the Mechaber saying? The Mechaber is saying the proper way to accomplish Petzias HaPas is take the loaf. Before you make a bracha, you decide you want to cut off this piece, this end piece over here. That's going to be your piece for hamotzie. Take the knife, cut into the loaf. How much should you cut into the loaf? You should cut into the loaf only so much that if you pick up the loaf by the end where it's cut, it will still support the rest of the loaf. Don't cut in more than that. If you make the cut so deep that if you try to pick up the loaf from here, this piece is going to separate and the rest of the loaf is going to fall, then it's considered that it's already cut off. And if it's considered that it's already cut off, then you're making the bracha on a prusa. We don't want you to make the bracha on a prusa. We want you to make the bracha on a shalim. So cut into it a little bit, make your bracha, and when you finish the bracha, cut it off completely, separate it, and eat it. That's what the Mechaber has described over here. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah. Back on Samach Beis and Aleph, Mishnah Berurah is cutting Dalet. V'yachtoich v'tzarich. Hi v'tzarich. The phrase that begins with the word v'tzarich, says the Mishnah Berurah, Pirush l'masha kasav b'tchila v'yachtoich. is the Mechaber explaining what he meant with the three words before it. The Mechaber said, V'yachtoich prusas habetzia, you should cut the piece that you're making the bracha on. Okay, how much should I cut it? I should cut it off completely before I make the bracha? No, explains the Mechaber, how much should you cut it? V'tzarch lachtoich ma'at, you should only cut it a little bit, etc., etc. So that's what we're saying here. Hai v'tzarich, the phrase that begins with v'tzarich, who pirush is the explanation, l'mashe kosav b'tchila v'yachtoich, of what the Mechaber started off saying, that you should cut the piece of the betzia. Ubira inyan hu, and the explanation of this inyan is, de bedina mevarach v'achakach paras hakikar. Me'ikar adin, you should make the bracha on the shalem, and then you should cut off the piece that you're going to eat after making the hamotzi. Kedei shetihiyeh kol bracha pashlema, so that the entire brachas hamotzi should be going on a loaf that's a shalem. Shehu derech covered lebracha, because that would be proper covered for the bracha of hamotzi. However, kedei shelo yiyeh shiui rav bein habracha la'achila v'yerah kaf sukkah, we don't want to have a hefsek between the hamotzi and the actual eating. So we don't want you to make Baruch Atah Shem Elokeinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz and then first take the knife and first start slicing. We want to minimize that hefsek. How do we minimize the hefsek? Says the Mishnah Berurah, kasva paiskim. So in order to minimize that hefsek, the paiskim write, the toiv lechatchila, that the best thing lechatchila would be sheyachtoich ma'at bakikar kodim shemaschel habracha. Cut into the loaf a little bit before you start making the bracha. So to put this in simple English, we want to be memayit the hefsek between the hamotzi and the eating as much as possible. So why should we leave 100% of the slicing off of the slice of bread that you're going to eat? Why should we leave that till after the bracha? Let's minimize it. Let's leave 75% of the slicing until after the bracha. Let's do 25% of the slicing before you even make the bracha. Now you only have 75% of the slicing left, so we would just memayit the hefsek by 25%. But there's only so much that we can be memayit the hefsek. Because if we're going to tell you to do 50% of the slice before you make the bracha, if you try to pick up the loaf by that piece, it's going to break off. In that case, it's already like a prusa, so now you're not making the bracha on a shalem. So let's see it inside. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'shir chitoch yema'at kidl kamon. But the cut has to be a small cut, not a deep cut, like we're going to see later. V'yavarech, and then make the bracha. V'achakach goyim lahafred a prusa ben a pas, and then finish slicing off the piece, and then you'll eat it. Ice cut and hay. You should only cut into the loaf ma'at, only a little bit. V'afilu b'prusa lo yaktach l'garmi kaidam ha-bracha. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is not only negeya when you're making a bracha hamotzi on an entire loaf. Let's say you're sitting down to eat 2 slices of bread. So you have a nice, beautiful loaf of sliced sandwich bread, and you took out 2 loaves of bread for your lunch, and now you're making a brachas hamotzi on 1 slice of bread. This halacha still applies, says the Mishnah Berurah. V'afilu b'prusa lo yachtich legamri kaidam habracha. Whatever piece you're going to eat after you make the bracha, don't take it off the rest of the slice completely before you make the bracha. Kidei sheyeh nira yoser gedola. What he's saying is like this. If you're only going to eat, let's say, 1 slice of rye bread, so you might think, okay, I'm not dealing with a whole loaf. I'll take my slice of rye bread, I'll rip off a piece, I'll make a hamotzi, and I'll eat it. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Make the bracha on the whole slice of rye bread. Because however bigger you can have the piece that you're making the bracha on is a bigger covet for the bracha. So take the piece of rye bread, start to separate the piece that you're going to eat right after the bracha a little bit, but don't separate it completely. Separate it only to the extent that if you would pick up the slice from that piece, it would remain attached. Make the bracha, and then rip it off, and then eat it. Ice cut vav. Shem loikein, because if you don't do it this way, and if what you do is you make a deep cut into the loaf. If you cut into the loaf so deeply, ad kidei shir, until the extent that if you would pick up the loaf by the small end that you're cutting off, lo yala hakikar imai, it wouldn't be able to lift up and support the rest of the loaf, and instead it'll be broken into pieces, that piece will break off, then nechshav kaparas muvdal me'akikar. Then that piece is already considered separated for the rest of the loaf. And then you're not making a bracha on a shalom. You lost the mile of making a bracha on a shalom. This is very cute what the Mishnah Berurah is saying. What the Mishnah Berurah is saying now is like this. The Mechaber said that what you should do is you should cut in, let's say you want to eat this end piece. So you should make a cut over here, but you should make sure that you only cut to the extent that if you pick up the loaf from here, from the small piece that you're cutting off, it will be able to support the big piece. If you cut so deeply that if you pick it up from the small piece, the big end of the loaf will fall and will break off, that's no good, because then it's considered that the small piece is already parus umuvdal. It's already cut off. Well, says the Chavetz Chaim, hold it a minute. Let's say you take a cut so deeply into the loaf that if you would pick it up from here, it would rip off. But you know why it's going to rip off? It's going to rip off because you're holding it by the small end, and the small end cannot support all the weight of the big end. But how about if you pick it up from the big end? So let's say you take a cut very deeply in over here, right? You cut very deeply down here. But if you pick up the loaf from this side, it'll zikah support this. This won't fall off because that little piece hardly weighs anything. So why are we saying that if you cut in deeply, so that if you pick it up from here, it'll rip off? It's considered that it's already parus umuvdal. It's considered that it's already separated. Why? Don't pick it up from here. Instead of picking it up from here, pick it up from here. And if you pick it up from here, then that won't be a problem. This piece will remain attached. Says the Chavetz Chaim. Even though if you hold the big side of the loaf, the cut side will be supported and will come up with it. That doesn't make it a shalom. Once it's cut to the extent that if you pick it up from the small side, it'll break, it's already ois shalom. Okay, ois cut in Zion. So the Mechaber said, make that cut, leave the slice attached to the rest of the loaf, make the bracha, and then finish slicing off the slice. So it's got Zayv Yanichena, with the phrase of V'yanichena, now the Mechaber is going back to what he said originally at the end of Samach Beis Amud Aleph. Kind of the sentence flows from there. It's almost as if you could skip the middle words of the Mechaber. It's v'yachtoich prusais habetzia. Start cutting off the piece that you're going to make the bracha on. V'yanichena, and leave it attached. V'yanichena mechuberes, leave it attached to the rest of the loaf. Lapas v'yaschil levarach, and start to make the bracha. Ois kol ches kitana. Oh no, I'm not up to that yet. Okay. So the Mechaber is giving us instructions precisely how we should do the Petzias HaPas. And the truth is, if you think about it, I think everybody that's listening to this year is very used to seeing on Shabbos, and we'll get to why Shabbos is different momentarily, I hope, that on Shabbos everybody takes the knife, they go like this, right? They almost don't even scratch into the loaf. But they take the knife, they pass it over the challah, and then they go, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech hamayim v'haaretz, and then they cut. It comes from this over here, Kuf Samach Zayin, Sif Aleph, where the Mechaber tells you the proper thing to do is to be memayit the hefsik between the bracha of hamotzi and the eating of the challah, of the bread, as much as possible. And the way you do that is, don't wait to cut the slice off completely until you finish the bracha. Start making the cut before you make the bracha. But don't make the cut all the way. Don't make the cut to the extent that it would fall off or that it can't support the rest of the loaf, because then you're not making the bracha on a shalom. So make a partial cut, and then make the bracha, and then cut it off. Now continues the Mechaber, 3 lines down, And the Mechaber says, when you do cut off the piece that you're going to eat for hamotzi, v'lo yivtza prusa ketana, don't cut off a very small piece. Memnei shenira kitzarayin, you look like a stingy guy. You've just made a brichas hamotzi, and now you're going to cut off a little measly piece of bread. You look like a miser. V'loy prusa yoser b'kebeya, you also shouldn't cut off a piece, a big honking piece that's bigger than a shir kibetza, memnei shenira karavson, because then you look like a glutton. So what should you do? You should cut off a medium-sized piece, a normal portion. That's what you should cut off, l'chvoid the bracha. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ktana, don't cut off a little miserly piece. Hainu ktana mikazayis. The Limud says, don't cut off a piece less than a kazayis. V'ayin b'bir agro be'el yerabba, that continue in greater detail on that discussion. Ice cut and test. On the other hand, don't cut off yotzei mikabetza. Don't cut off a piece that's larger than the volume of an egg, because then you look like a glutton. Hainu in part now, very important halacha here. Says the Chavetz Chaim, when is this an issue? Hainu in parsa kitei lechal tekef mimenu gufa. When the Mechaber says, don't cut off a piece that's larger than the volume of a kibetza, what he means is, if you're cutting off a slice that you intend to eat now, don't cut off a piece that's bigger than a kibetza, because then you look like a glutton. Aval ein bechlal zeh, but what is not included in this is, mashe parsil chaticha gedola me'akikar. Let's say you're taka making a hamotzi, like on a whole challah, or on a whole loaf of rye bread. If you want, what you could do is, if you want to cut the loaf of rye bread in half, and then you're going to cut off a piece to eat for the hamotzi, that's okay. Then you don't look like a glutton. Now the only thing is, what disturbs me about that is, but how about the hefsek? It would seem to me that you can't do that. You can't cut the loaf of rye bread in half and then cut off a piece and eat it for the hamotzi, because then you made an unnecessary cut between the hamotzi and the achila. But the takeaway over here that I take away from this is, let's say Taka Friday night or Shabbos day by the Shabbos Suda. You have 6 people sitting around the table you have to give out challah to, right? So what you want to do is, you want to make the hamotzi, then you want to take one of the challahs and you want to cut it in half. And then from that half, you're going to cut off pieces for yourself and to give everybody else. Now the half of challah might be bigger than the share of a kibetza. That's not a problem, because you're not nira karav sedusa. You don't look like a glutton, because I didn't cut off a piece that I intend to eat. I cut off a piece that I intend to cut pieces off of. And over there, it's not an unnecessary cut. It's a necessary cut. I need to cut off a section of the challah that I'm now going to cut into pieces to give out. So that's not an unnecessary cut. But if you're sitting alone by a Suda, and you have a whole challah, and you make a bracha on the challah, it would seem to me that you got to make one cut of what you're going to eat. And then it shouldn't be bigger than the volume of an egg. It shouldn't be bigger than a kibetza, because you're near a karav senusa. Nor should you cut the challah in half and then cut yourself a piece from that half, because l'chayr you're making an unnecessary hefsek, you're making an unnecessary cut. Okay. You know what? I hoped to get further, but I'm going to stop over here, because if I want to go weiter, I have to start reading the Ramah, and it doesn't make sense to start reading the Ramah here and then end by reading the Ramah and not do any Mishnah Berurah, and then we'll have to read it again tomorrow. So we're going to stop over here, 4 lines down on Samach Beis and Beis in the Shulchan Aruch, by the Haggah, by the words of the Ramah. Thank you so much for joining me for Limud HaTorah. This is Limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. Rosh should send Yeshua and first Panash Shaduchim to all those in need. And Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and the Sunnah Batzaru Batshivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam and Bein Bayabasha Hamakay Birachem Aleihem V'Yitziim Mitzara L'Rvacha Me'afela L'Oira U'Mishibad L'Geula Hashta B'Gala V'Zman Kariv V'Neimar Amen. Be well.